讲席教授张小燕老师。
Let's welcome the moderator, Professor Zhang Xiaoyan, Chair Professor and Associate Dean of Tsinghua PBCSF, onto the stage.
各位嘉宾。
Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to session 3 of our discussion this afternoon. I'm Zhang Xiaoyan, Chair Professor of Finance. The global economic fragmentation is becoming more and more prominent. In terms of different paths, and these divergences have created new challenges for all the countries in the world, but China and the United States have entered a trade war ceasefire, and given the climate change and technological challenges, we still need international cooperation. So today, we are going to discuss how policymakers deal with these challenges and how to promote multilateral cooperation. This afternoon, we are honored to have 4 panelists with us. Let me first introduce them. Kairat Kelimbetov, former Deputy Prime Minister of Kazakhstan, former Governor of the National Bank of Kazakhstan, and Mr. Ouyang Weimin, Vice President, China Society for Finance and Banking, former President of the China Development Bank, and the former Deputy Governor of Guangdong, and Boris Vujčić, Governor of Croatian National Bank, and Nouriel Roubini, Professor Emeritus, NYU Stern School of Business, and also the Chairman and the CEO of the Roubini Consulting Firm. Please make your way to the stage. Okay. So there are 2 parts to this session. First, I'd like to invite the 4 panelists to deliver a short speech.
You probably need to wear that. Okay. 每一位嘉宾呢有8分钟的时间。首先呢，我们有请
panelist will have 8 minutes to make your short presentation. So the first speaker is
you can sit over here. Yes, please.
Kelimbetov.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for School of Finance of PBOC to be here and discuss. I think we're living in a very interesting time. And today, since very beginning, it was since early morning, we talk about uncertainty. And uncertainty is the biggest problem for any economic policy makers any time. And I think currently, so we see that a lot of happening, and there is no yet clear picture what are the scenarios can be in terms of the, let's say, change in the world. And today, Mr. Castelli already mentioned and cited Mr. Antonio Gramsci in terms of the new world struggles to be born. And I think and we don't know how the new world will look like. At least the previous understanding, we used to know what is the rules, and it was like a rules-based system, and we did understand these rules. And now I believe it's like a little bit different. And in these terms, is always when it's like uncertainty, you try to understand what is economic theory should say about this. I'm sure that Professor Roubini will later on will give us analogy. But as far as I remember, this very similar to the beginning of the situation of the Great Depression in the 1930s in the United States, with the same tariff war, with the same good ideas, and but the results was, I think that was like a negative lessons which all the economic scientists concluded from this. And nowadays we see it's like an approach of the so-called zero-sum game, where should be winners, should be losers, and would be we will see what would be the next. At least the positive news was that the dispute was postponed, so we have a pause, and so I believe that the countries will try to figure out the better decision. But it also reminds me that it's like more not country-to-country talk, but the corporation to corporation. So that's more business transaction looks like. So if it's like a new principles, is also more or less clear what should be the consequences. And also like looks like game, like who blinks first, and it's a different motivation here, which I see that was one and different motivation, different horizons. So I think majority in this room prefer to live in the previous formula of the globalization, but if it will be less globalization, more regionalization, I think is also there are some more opportunities which we at least we are in Central Asia understand that what we should do. We definitely suffering when the great powers are kind of competing with each other. I believe that emerging markets in these terms are like collateral damage for them, but anyway, the crisis from one side, but the opportunities from the other side is always the case. So we're looking forward for this. Thank you.
谢谢克里姆别托夫博士的发
Thank you,
言。
Dr.
下面欧阳博士，您是
Now
不
we'd
是
like
准备
to
了
give the
PPT？
floor
好
to
的，请。
Dr. Ouyang, who has prepared us a PPT.
这个我简要的给大家报告一下啊，
I would
不会
like
超过
to
8分钟。
report to you within
这
8
个
minutes.
我讲的一个主题呢，就是要
And
顺
the
应和
theme
坚定了全球化、
Is
一
that
体化的
how
趋势。
can we just
那么在讲这个问题之前呢，我们先要对
continue
碎片化做一个
our
基本的定义。
trend of
那么它是
globalization?
一个相
First
对
of
概
all,
念，
we
相
need
对于
to
全球化
give a
和一体
definition
化来
of
的。那
fragmentation.
么我理解了碎片化是指
I
全球经济
believe
一体化的过程
fragmentation
中，
means
由
that
于
during
认
the
知的偏差
processes of
地缘政治、
economic
民粹主义、贸易保护主义等
consolidation
要素，
because
导
of
致全球
the
贸易、投资、技术
nationalism,
交流等经济活动逐步分化，
that
形成多个
the
相对独立的
global
经济集
trade
团
and
和区域的一个
economic
现象。
exchanges
所以我觉得
had
对于这样一个定
gradually
义是非
be
常重要的，
segmented.
也是
So I
对于我
believe
们下一
such a
步
definition
研
is
究、
of
交
high
流和沟
importance
通。
because this would be
那么
able
它的表现呢，就是国家间的经济
build
联
a
系、
solid
人为的
foundation
减
for
弱、
future
贸易壁垒
discussions.
有意的增
I
加、
believe
技术呢
it
有意的
can
脱钩、
be
要素流动的
demonstrated
人
in a
为的
way
设置限制，
that we
以
have
及全球产业链和供
purposely
应链
set
的
up
主动
trade
的切断。
barriers as well as
那么我这里
the
重点讲一下呢，就
cutting
是
off of
我认
the
为后面
economic
这些
and social ties among different
这
countries.
个贸易保护主义
So
啊、
I
民粹
believe
主义
the
啊，
trade
这个
protectionism as well
首先
as
是源于这个
nationalism
认知的偏差
probably arises from
认知的
the
偏差。
misconception.
那么这个认知的偏差这方面呢，
The
就
so-called
是
misconception
包括这几个方面
can be defined
第
in
一
the
就是
following areas.
认为
First of all,
顺差国在
first
榨
of all, they believe
偷窃
that
敲
those
竹
who
杠
have
逆差国
trade
吃亏了、受
surplus
损、上当
has
这是第一个。
been stealing
因为
from
他
the
把贸易
countries that have
这
been
个顺
suffered
差和
from
逆
trade
差当成是
deficits.
吃亏了或者
They
占便宜
believe
了。
that it
第
is
二个呢，就是
really
关税
such
是
a
由出口国来
zero-sum
承
game.
担的，而
And
不是由
second
进
one,
口国
that the
承担。
tariff
或者说
should
呢，
be
出口国
undertaken
承
by
担
the
的比
exporting
例
countries instead
更
of
高
by the importing
所以他
countries.
觉得加关税
But
对
at
自己的
least
国家有
that is
利。
why they
第
believe
三个
that
呢，认为
adding
加征
tariffs
关税
will
可
be
以迫使
beneficial
产业
for
企
the
业回
country
归
that has
本
been
土
imposing
啊，
tariffs.
他们认为呢，就是汇率操纵、政府补贴会有利于实施国际贸易优势的形成，不利于国际贸易的公平。第五一个就是都想活成对方的样子啊，比方说做消费大国或者是制造业大国。那么针对这几个认知的，我认为都是几个认知的偏差，要纠正这几个。
Such misconceptions, think tanks, research institutions need to focus on the following several issues. First of all, that is the importance of balance of the economic trade and long-term trade surplus or deficit. Are they having advantages or disadvantages? And second one, and the so-called world currency and how it is formed and what is it is going forward. And next one is that the industrial chain and the value chain cannot be separated from each other. And the next point we need to study is that when the productivity level are close and when the input prices are also close to each other, why the blue collars in the advanced economies are actually hurt. That is probably why so many American workers have voted for Donald Trump. And how can we have a balance between such a labor-intensive economy with a capital or technological-intensive economy? And the next point is that the trade barrier, will it have a backlash? On the 100 days of the new American administration, the U.S. stock had nosedived for 8%, and American dollars had devalued for 10%. And Tesla's Q1 profit had nosedived for 71%. And since U.S. accounts for 15% of the world trade, why it would want to impose tariffs while at the same time irritating the rest of the world? So these are several of the questions that I want to address. Now, let me just report to you how can we react to the so-called global fragmentation. First of all, we need to have such idea of the community of shared future of mankind. We need to stay committed to the historical trend of globalization. Fragmentation is only temporary and it is harmful, so we need to inject confidence of reacting to such globalization. And secondly, we need to rectify our misconceptions. We need to come back to the fundamentals of the economy so as we can tell our story in a very reasonable way so that we would be enable more people to realize the harmfulness of fragmentation and the strength of globalization so that we can make the best of it. And the last thing that I want to cite is the motto from the Tsinghua University, which is action speaks much louder than words. And then nextly, we need to conduct international exchanges. We also need to stay committed to the spirit of our Chinese central government policies. The next point is to further diversify our economy. And the next point I want to mention is to further encourage the technological innovation and cooperation. In this regard, I do believe it is highly important. In yesterday's closed-door meeting, the advance of the productivity and the technological innovation will have a significant influence to many sectors. Some of the enterprises will take the chance to prosper, while others may not be even able to survive. So it is really a question of whether you are a representation of the advanced productivity. If that is the case, you will be able to excel. And fourthly, we need to safeguard the stability of the financial market. That is the coordination of the financial regulation as well as the construction of the financial infrastructure. In this regard, we have been doing such a great job, but we still need to enhance the capital connections. And the fifth point is the education and the training of the talents. And the sixth point is about the policy coordination and the communication. And the last point is that we need to have the best wishes and make our utmost efforts. However, still need to prepare for the worst scenarios. China is not really ready to fight any wars, but as I would like to quote from the Chinese old proverbs, even though we are a very big country, if you wage battles across all fronts, you will definitely die. However, we are not afraid of fighting a battle if there is a battle to fight. That is all from me. Thank you so much. I would like to thank Dr. Ouyang for your speech. Now we would like to give the floor. 武契奇博士，您是不是已经做好了准备要做演讲？好吗？
Thank you very much. Again, a pleasure to be again with you at your excellent conference. Let me try to frame what we call a fragmentation and globalization for a moment in a historical perspective. The most usual measure of the globalization is a share of trade in the GDP. Now, if you look at that, let's say 20th, 21st century, basically we have four periods, I would say. One is the increase in the globalization measured by the share of trade in the GDP from the, let's say, late 19th century all the way up until the First World War, where the trade in GDP reached 40% of the GDP. Then, between the beginning of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, so we're talking about 1914 until 1945, there was a decline in the globalization. Let's call it that way. Nobody called it that way at that time, but let's say the conduciveness of trade in the growth, where the share of trade in GDP fell down from 40% down to 20%. And then, post-Second World War, we had a continuous growth again of the share of trade in GDP, globalization, as we called it, all the way up to the great financial crisis, 2009. And actually, what we now focus on the deglobalization, but since the GFC already, 2009, the share of trade in GDP stopped growing. And actually, interestingly, for emerging market countries, it even declined somewhat over the last 15 years. So I would say, from today's point of view, when we talk about the fragmentation or deglobalization, it's not such a new phenomenon. And we've been there already for 15 years, compared to the period definitely before that. But it's not, of course, then if you look at the growth, world GDP growth, world GDP was growing fastest when the trade in GDP was growing fastest. So in that sense, we can conclude, yeah, trade is good for growth. But it's not only the trade, it's also a structure of trade. Now, when we talk about the fragmentation, we also talk about the structure of trade. And what we've seen recently is also not that new, because over the last 10 years, we already see a decoupling, primarily between China and US in trade. If you look at the components of growth last 5 years compared to the 5 years before, you see already diversion of trade between US and China, and then on top of that, particularly Europe and Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. So I just want to say we're not today, after the 2nd of April, in a completely new situation. It's just another spin on what we have been seeing for the last 15 years to some extent. Now, when we think about most recent period, from the European point of view, and I'm going to take a European view now, of course, the US is the most important trading partner for Europe. And when we do all kinds of simulations trying to see what the impact of the tariffs might be on Europe or the US, it turns out that the long-run impact on GDP growth in Europe is much more modest than on the US. So there are a number of papers estimates, and the estimates for Europe range from plus 0.2 to minus 0.3% of GDP, while for the US we have estimates from plus 0.3 to minus 2% impact on the growth of GDP. If you look at the trade diversion, they're probably most impacted in Europe would be Italy, followed by Germany. But then again, the total trade diversion impact on Europe does not seem to be very large. There has been quite a lot of talk about what if China and US stop trading, which was pretty much the consequence of the tariffs before the agreement in Geneva on the moderating of the rates of tariffs between the US and China. And then we simply assumed in a simple model that the Chinese exports stay the same as they were before, while they trade nothing with US. All other trading partners, depending on the share of trade, take equal amount of imports. So China diverts all trade from US to the other trading partners. That led to the increase in the imports in euro area of 3%, which is not that huge. No? So sometimes people exaggerate immediate effects of the trade diversion. Now, between the European Union and US, if we take today's situation after the 9th of April, when there was a pause and Europe has a tariff rate of 10% plus 25% steel, aluminum, and cars, that brings the effective tariff rate for Europe up to 13.8% on goods, but 8.5% if you take goods and services together. Another thing which I want to emphasize is that there is way too much, I think, emphasis on the goods trade. We tend to forget that the trade, current account, that's goods and services. And for example, between the euro area and the US takes 17% of total European exports, which is 764 billion euros, of goods and services, and of which goods are only 1/3. 2/3 are services. And we continuously keep on talking about the goods, forgetting about the services component. While 18% of euro area imports come from the US, 741 billion, and US has a large surplus in the services trade. So Europe has a surplus in the goods trade of 179 billion euros, while the US has a surplus in services trade of 156 billion euros. So the overall, if you look at the current account, as we do as economists, basically the deficit is only 23 billion, which is not such a large number, given the total amount of the trade that we see. Europe has, as you know, put also on hold its own tariffs of 25% because they were announced just as the tariffs were posed. on 22 billion of the imports from the US, which is pretty much the same number as the steel and aluminium, which 26 billion euros of the European imports, exports to the US. Okay, then on the impact on the inflation, which is more of a focus of the central bank, and they're going to stop. That's a bit more difficult to estimate because it really depends on whether there are retaliations or not. What's the end game with the tariffs? Basically, in a short run, depending on whether there is a retaliation, where do we end up with talks about tariffs with the US? We estimate that the impact on inflation will also be modest because we do not envisage at the moment high retaliatory tariffs on the European side, and because the trade diversion actually works in a deflationary way on the inflation in Europe. In the longer run, the impact should be of the deglobalization, fragmentation, or the tariffs be more inflationary because you have a misallocation of the resources. Any kind of misallocation of the resources should lead to the lower productivity. Lower productivity should mean somewhat higher inflationary pressures. But there again, we have to also have in mind that there are many other long-term factors which impact the inflation outlook. One is, for example, demographic changes, aging of the population, whereby there are, of course, competing theories, as we know. Some believe that the aging of the population is inflationary, some think it's deflationary, depending what assumptions you make about the saving of the population, whether they are forward-looking, whether you have a kind of a Ricardian equivalence, people knowing that they will be living longer, so they save more, or simply there are less savers because there are more people retired, so you have a less savings in the future. So some people believe one, the other people, the other one prevails. But I think that the important thing to, again, remember is that for sure we will not have deflationary pressures which happened between 80s and 2010s before the GFC, where particularly in China, but also in Central and East Europe, you had a huge amount of the labor force which was basically transitioned from an extremely low productivity production to a higher productivity production. That kind of a switch of the population will never happen again for demographic and political economy reasons. That has led to very high productivity growth in China or in Central and East Europe and in other emerging market economies, which put definitely deflationary pressures. So that's gone. But then you have a decarbonization. That's inflationary. We can discuss how much, but it's certainly inflationary in the long run. You have a defense spending in Europe, which will be ramped up now. But then you also have a digitalization, which can work in a completely different way. Things about which Nouriel yesterday talked, all kinds of the very innovative sectors where you could see a huge increase in productivity in the next 10 to 20 years, which is then deflationary. But that then poses, and I'm not going to discuss that, but that poses a question for the central banks. If you have that kind of a deflationary shock, where you have an immense increase in productivity because of the innovation, whether we should really then lean against that or not. Because if you look, for example, at the minus 1.2, minus 2%, but that was good because it was coming from the high productivity growth. It was not kind of a demand pool, inflation, fiscally induced inflation or anything like that. But this is a question for the central bankers to think through if we see such a huge productivity gains in the future. And I'm going to stop here for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Vujčić. And Professor Roubini, you ready to share? Yes, please. You want to go over there? Okay.
There are 4 questions that I'd like to address briefly in my initial remarks. One is what has been the contribution of Trump's tariff to the current economic fragmentation. Secondly, the question of whether the US and China negotiations are a true de-escalation or just a temporary truce that's going to lead to further trade wars. 3, what kind of steps can be taken to prevent the return to protectionism, and 4, which areas of multilateral cooperation can be used or attempted in order to prevent fragmentation. Now, the current kind of conventional wisdom, I think, is wrong, is that the current deglobalization is driven mostly by Trump coming back to power and being protectionist. But the reality is that the backlash against globalization or hyperglobalization already started about 25 years ago. Now, as economists, we know what are the benefits of trade and globalization and economic integration. They are strong, but there was a backlash, and I think this backlash was driven by many factors. Number one is that while trade and globalization is overall increasing welfare, there are winners and losers, both within countries and across countries. Within countries, for example, low value-added, low-skilled, blue-collar manufacturing workers in the US were subject to the China shock. And even across countries, there are winners and losers. Secondly, unfortunately, we live in a world in which there is a geopolitical recession, if not a depression, that is leading then to fragmentation, the rivalry between US and China. People care more now about economic security than economic efficiency, and there's a rivalry on who's going to be dominating the industries and the technologies of the future. 3, as Danny Roderick once wrote a book about, he pointed out that there is a trilemma, that you cannot have at the same time hyper-globalization, national sovereignty, and democratic decision-making. You can get 2 out of 3, but not all 3 of them. And many countries are not willing to give up on national sovereignty and democratic decision-making, and therefore hyper-globalization is not acceptable. 4, during COVID, we realized that there is a weakness and fragilities of global supply chains, and being dependent for pharma products or PPE and others on foreign countries that are restricting the export of this thing becomes a problem, and that led again to forms of protectionism. 5, in the last decades, we've had severe and repeated financial crises, both in emerging markets and advanced economies like the GFC, and therefore the argument for unfettered capital mobility on inflows and outflows has taken a hit. Hot money capital flows can come into a country and get out very fast, and therefore some restriction might be warranted. 6, we've had these persistent global current account imbalances that have led to concerns about losses permanently of manufacturing jobs, especially in the US and advanced economies. The China shock has been significant, at least for some parts of the US manufacturing. 7, rightly or wrongly, in my view, wrongly, there has been a backlash against migration from poor to rich, from south to north. For whatever reason, there is now, maybe because people mistake and blame on migrants, economic troubles that are caused by technology or poor policies, but there is a backlash against migration of labor. 8, there is resource nationalism. Increasingly, not only in emerging markets, but also in advanced economies, people don't want their own national, resources, whether they're mining resources or infrastructures or ports or you name it, to be controlled, unquote, by foreigners. 9, there has been a rise in income inequality and wealth inequality and economic insecurity, and that has led a backlash against liberal democracy, democratic capitalism, and a resurgence of populist and nativist kind of economic policy. They tend to be anti-trade, anti-migration, and anti-globalization. And finally, there has been a breakdown of the Washington consensus that was saying that for most countries, the best thing is to privatize, to have freer markets, and having trade liberalization and globalization. And paradoxically, the success of China, that was a model of a variant of state capitalism, was an alternative to this Washington consensus. And people said there are other ways of doing economic success that is not traditional free market capitalism. So unfortunately, or fortunately, hyper-globalization is over, and now people are talking about deglobalization, slowbalization, globalization, de-risking, decoupling, emphasizing security over economic efficiency. And whether we like it or not, there will be less goods in trade, less trade in goods, less trade in services, in the movement of capital and foreign direct investment, in labor migration across countries, and restriction to trade in data, technology, and information, because these become of national security importance. So hyper-globalization and laissez-faire economic policies are over, and everybody is now talking about what? Industrial policies, about various types of protectionism, about government intervention in the economy, about protecting national champions that are workers and firms, about providing subsidies or tax credits to favorite firms or sectors that are considered of national importance, reshoring, friendshoring, or nearshoring, going from just-in-time to just-in-case, from China to China +1, and having, of course, a rivalry in the technology in the future that implies, again, industrial policies to support some firms and some sectors are important. So less importance to economic efficiency and allocation of savings to the right investment in the right countries, and more importance of national security and of economic security. Second point about the US-China. Is it a real de-escalation or just a temporary truce? We don't know. For now, a truce of 90 days, reduction of the reciprocal tariffs only to 10%, 20% on fentanyl. But if you're looking at the effective tariffs that the US imposing on China, because there were previous tariffs, the current effective rate is about 39%. 19% if you were excluding the 20% on fentanyl. We hope that this is just a permanent de-escalation rather than a temporary truce, but we don't know. If you look at the United States and what many people in the White House are saying, the litany of complaints about China is endless. China has tariffary barriers, non-tariffary barriers, intellectual property protection that is not there, lack of market access, government procurement, subsidy of export, subsidizing labor, capital, land, energy, you name it, industrial policies, and of course, unquote, manipulating their currency and keep it weaker than otherwise, and fentanyl. How you reach an agreement on all these things? There was an attempt in 2019 on dealing with all these issues and with some commitments by China to buy at least $200 billion of US goods. Those things fell out of the window during COVID. Whether they're going to come back or not, I think is an open question. The point is achieving a grand bargain where you are de-risking relationship in things that are of national security importance, but you don't have full decoupling, is not going to be easy. Now, what are the alternatives to this fragmentation? This morning, those of you who listened to Nobel Prize winner Mike Pence, he said, if the US is going to go protectionism, we can have a new multilateral system that is revamped, that is led by the European Union, other advanced economies, China and Global South, to maintain the multilateral economic system of relatively free trade. I don't think that's going to be quite likely. It's going to be not quite likely because the US is going to go to friends and allies, and even those who are not formal allies like those in the GCC, so friends and allies in NATO, countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and others, and it's going to tell them, if you want to have our own security, you have either to pay for it or you have to spend more on your national security yourself. 2% of GDP is not anymore a ceiling, it's a floor. And most likely Europe will have to spend more than 2%, given the threats are coming from Russia, probably something closer to 3%. And if you spend more on defense, you'll have to buy more US weapons. The idea that Europeans are going to depend only on their own weapons is kind of silly, given the supply chains of defense tech. You'll have to buy more energy and LNG from the United States. After all, Europe doesn't want to have it from Russia, nor want economies like Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan. You'll have to buy more agricultural products of the United States. And there'll be also coordination with India, Japan, and South Korea on shipbuilding that is currently dominated by China. U.S. consider that a sector of national security importance, so there'll be more coordination or more shipbuilding by friends and allies. Additionally, the U.S. is going to tell friends and allies, if you want to have access to our high-tech models and our deep tech technology, whether it's semiconductors, AI models, LLMs, data centers, you can have access to all of these. You'll be part of our own technological order, but then you have to de-risk your relationship with China on high-tech and sensitive national security sectors. Whether you like it or not, you'll have to choose on technology, whether you're with US or China. You're not going to be able to be in between. We'll have nearshoring, we'll have friendshoring, we'll have some reshoring. Maybe not full reshoring, but certainly nearshoring and friendshoring is going to be good enough for the US. And since the dollar has started to weaken, then whether Europe, Japan, and others allow further their currency to appreciate, that's going to help with dealing with these global imbalances. And finally, the US is going to tell friends and allies, don't de-dollarize and maintain the US dollar as the global reserve currency. So that's what's going to happen, and hopefully we'll get a grand bargain with China as well, even if that's going to be hard. Finally, what are the potential areas of multilateral cooperation beyond trade? There are many of them, but it's not easy to cooperate in this world of geopolitical rivalries. Global climate change is one of them, but even before the US got out of the Paris Accord under Trump, it was not easy on agreeing on achieving the targets of the Paris Accord. Secondly, probably you want to have limits to cyber warfare. Cyber warfare can be as destructive as conventional weapons, if not nuclear weapons. There could be mutual assured destruction in infrastructure. So maybe agreements on avoiding escalation of cyber warfare is an area of importance. Three, there should be agreements on nuclear proliferation. Everybody is obsessed about the damage of climate change, but the damage from climate change is going to take decades, maybe a century, to become really something of a disaster. If there was a nuclear exchange, say, between India and Pakistan, the nuclear winter is going to destroy the world, literally. The nuclear cloud will have consequences for everybody else, let alone if there was a nuclear exchange between US and Russia or US and China. So that's an area in which more cooperation can occur. Of course, it's hard to cooperate in a world of geopolitical rivalries, but China may have a constructive attitude towards the resolution of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. If China was going and telling Putin, enough is enough, get a ceasefire, you can put pressure on Putin to do so. And if you want to maintain good relations, trade and otherwise with Europe, it will be sensible to do so. And on other things, like constraining the aggressive behavior of North Korea. This is not just a risk to Japan or South Korea, but it's also a risk to China. And of course, on the issue of Taiwan, you need restraint, both on the United States side, returning to the one China policy and constructive ambiguity, but on the Chinese side, you need patience, and you also need to reaffirm that any reunification with Taiwan should be peaceful. There is a way to cooperate on international financial stability, reforming the IMF and the World Bank system, more chairs and shares, cooperating at the FSB at the BIS level on financial stability. You can try to limit protectionism with a grand bargain on trade and trying to reduce the global current account imbalances that are a source of friction. AI is going to require some regulation, not only within countries, but also across countries. Not easy to be made, but there is a risk of unfettered use of AI, even on a cross-border basis. And of course, COVID-19 is not going to be the last of global pandemics. During COVID-19, there was a blame game. US was blaming China, China was blaming the US. Hopefully next time around, we can prevent the pandemic in the first place and cooperate in a better way. Of course, there will be some de-risking and strategic national autonomy in strategic sectors of the economy, but we can prevent overall decoupling that will be destructive of global trade. And of course, the new frontiers of business go beyond the traditional one. There is space exploration and exploitation. There is a great game in the Arctic and in Antarctica, and of course, deep sea mining. These are all global public goods that require actually some degree of agreement and cooperation. And finally, I would suggest that China should be more, consistent in providing global public goods rather than free riding on the global economic and trading system. So there is limits to cooperation, but doesn't mean that we should have been trying. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roubini. 我就不 summarize， 我就不总结各位的发言了。但是我想各位听众也已经看到了不管我们的这个就是同一个问题我们有很多不一样的角度来看问题。好感谢各位富有洞见的开场发言，已经为我们提供了非常多的丰富的视角。那么接下来呢，我们进入这个论坛的第二个部分我会跟各位嘉宾呢提一些问题，那么大家也请带上需要这个同声传译的话我如果问到哪位嘉宾的话呢，他熟悉的语言是哪个语言，我会换语言Okay, are you guys ready? 所以我们let me start a question first with Dr. Kelimbetov. Let me ask you a very important question. You know, I think this question has been answered a little bit in the previous discussion, but I still want to hear an exact answer. So what do you think? To what extent have President Trump's tariff policies contributed to global economic fragmentation? And how have these measures impacted other markets, for instance, your national market?
Thank you very much. So I believe Governor Vujčić already and Professor Roubini tried to do the 3D perception what was let's say situation now and what's the difference, and I think that even also would like to echo what would be the future of globalization, and what we see now is different from what we've seen in 30s when was kind of the countries tried to isolate each other, and it was like a more protectionism and regionalism. So currently, I think everyone is enjoying the globalization. But I think that big countries want to bring their own understanding how the globalization should look like and how it should be the distributions of benefits of the globalization. And has been mentioned by Professor Roubini. So maybe it's like different club membership. So it's like, let's say, developed country, global south, or whatever is the different scenarios can be. But if you remember, so we enjoy last 40 years in emerging markets, and it was like 40 years of the opening up reforms, opening up economy reforms in China. So the rule was like you can get access to, let's say, developed market, and then it will be like a fair trade. The fairness definition now is completely different, and I think that it will, there is a need to redefine the rules in terms of what we see as a dispute. And I think it looks like it would not be the de-escalation of this discussion, maybe some postpone. I think in the short term, it's very difficult to really to have a big changes because it's countries, US and China, for example, or Europe and China, and Europe and US are very much depends from each other. So we've seen in the COVID, if the China would be more closed, let's say, then it will be really a disaster for so global supply chain, let's say. And currently, so I believe that the China provide, let's say, less let's say, cost for any kind of goods and services and world-class infrastructure? Could it be replaced by whatever reshoring or friendshoring? I'm not sure that in this scale it can be so easy be changed. But from the other side, China imported the tech IPs from US is also very much interconnected, and I believe that country cannot, any kind of corporation wouldn't like to punish themselves by this kind of the external tariffs. This morning also the Nobel Prize winner Michael Spence mentioned about, I think, the context of this competition, and we talk about since morning also this competitive game rather than cooperative. The context is this tech race, especially competition in terms of the development of artificial intelligence. That can create real divide, which is like would be the tech divide, access to the technologies. And back to your questions, what to do to emerging markets, which are neutral and we are in between, let's say. In Kazakhstan or in Central Asia, we not suffered severely from the new tariffs proposed, but I think that what we really suffered is more this uncertainty and volatility of the markets, which again, it can be, let's say, for countries which are commodities driven, is low prices for oil and gas, for any kind of the energy products, mining, agriculture. That will suffer it us much more. So in these terms, I think, again, I like how Professor Roubini bring so many areas for collaboration. So if we will see that type of the transactions that let's make tariffs versus tariffs, let's say this way, but let's cooperate in the other areas. You can provide us this, we need from you this. This is, I think, the bilateral cooperation can really adjust the current tension, and we will see more constructive dialogue in the future.
我换中文了啊，那个非常感谢刚才Kelimbetov 博士的回答，其实也跟大家分享一下。他说呢，作为一个发展中国家，其实这个关税，这个特朗普的关税战啊，对发展中国家影响很大的是什么呢？就是它带来的不确定性啊。 对大家其实是成本非常非常高的。那么，既然我们在这个话题上，欧阳博士，那我问您下面一个比较难的问题啊。那么近期呢，中美经贸会谈谈判，其实已经达成了一定的这么一个 agreement， 有一个大家都同意的解决方案啊。 您刚才我特别感谢您刚才的 PPT 呢，把碎片化做了一个总体上的这么一个思考。我想问您的是，那么最近的这个谈判呢，是代表了一种实质性的缓和，还是仅仅是阶段性的休战？ 下面还有更多的这个结构性的改变还是很难，就是还是要接着打下去呢？还是说，我先问啊，那个这个是一个暂时性的休战呢，还是一个实质性的缓和？您的观点是什么？
A substantial progress. I think the previous speakers have spoken about this, and I agree with their views. On the one hand, China wants to promote globalization and global integration, and we're putting a lot of efforts in this area. And in the recent history of China, in the last 200 years, China has suffered from closed-door policies, and that led to terrible consequences. So hundreds of years ago, Western countries demanded that China open up, and now they close its doors. So if China closes its doors, I think that would be the responsibility of the United States. Now, the United States is thinking about closing its own doors. And that's a scenario we've never imagined. So whatever happens with the trade agreement, I think there's still opportunity, and we believe in Marxism, so I think that there are contradictions all around, and we work towards removing these conflicts. So we need to be determined. First, we need to be determined in our principles and concepts. So a community of shared future, I think, is a great concept. Division and a war leads to destruction. So even if you kill 1,000 of your enemies, you suffer 800 deaths on your own side. So wars actually benefit no one. As a community of a shared future, we need to work together to solve global problems. I think that's the right way to go. So we need to be determined of our principle and our choices. So we want to be open to the outside world, and I think we are on the right side of history. And now we see a reversal of the situation, and that's kind of ironic. And second, we need to be determined to look at this problem in a dialectic way. So there are conflicts, but there are also opportunities. We need to adhere to our principles, and we want to build this community of shared future based on mutual respect and mutual benefits. I remember I visited a village a few years ago, and I met with an old lady in her 80s, and she's eating, and I asked him whether their living standards have improved, and we're really delighted to hear their views. But she said something that really shocked me. She said that we now have a better life because this is what you strive for. But only when all of us are living well can the whole society be well. So old people as well as children need to be living a better life. So that really was very touching. So to solve the global problems, we need to work together to achieve mutual prosperity. So we need to have sovereignty, we need to have independence, and we should not focus on just the interests of one country. So the America first is not the way to go. We need all the countries to share the responsibilities and to overcome difficulties to achieve mutual prosperity. Only when all the countries are living well that the world is a better place. And we need to be determined in our actions. And I'm a firm believer in the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think China is sincere in helping other countries build infrastructure, and we offer loans without any strings attached. It's based on friendly consultation.
当地老百姓很高兴。所以我们有句古话叫做“事事兴于神变，行变了”，对吧？如果我们看到这些事实，就像刚才教授说的，如果有些国家他整天抱怨，就是要找茬，那这个问题也确实也不好解决。但是我认为这是个暂时现象，所以我们只要信念坚定、原则坚定、行动坚定，大家好才是真好。全球化就是不可阻挡的趋势。
谢谢欧阳博士。Thank you. I'm going to switch to English again. You know, before I ask Boris your next question, I have to say we recently visited United States. People ask us that, are you sure China really is opening up? What they don't understand is cultural-wise, like Dr. Ouyang just mentioned, for the past 200 years, China suffered a lot by closing up. So we really mean it when we say high-quality opening up. So I really, again, appreciate Ouyang Boshi, your sharing with us about the stories and everything. Okay, Boris, are you ready? And here's the question designed for you. Okay, my question is, most recently, Croatia has recently adopted Euro. How do you see your country balancing national priorities with broader Eurozone objectives, especially in today's fragmented and uncertain global environment?
Yeah, well, one thing is sure, I would say it makes sense for a small open economy like Croatia to adopt the reserve currency. We know the advantages of having a reserve currency, and Croatia has, since it joined the Eurozone, started already to experience. First, of course, the costs of borrowing come down because risk-wise, country is looking better. There's no more foreign currency risk in the first place. And for small and open economies, it's very difficult to manage the foreign currency risk. Not in the good times. In the good times, it doesn't matter, really. In the good times, I would say you don't have to be a part of the larger currency area. But whenever there is a big crisis, first ones who are hit are the small open economies with their own currencies. And then you have to pay a high price to manage the stability, much higher than if you are within a large reserve currency as Euro is, and we've seen that clearly during the COVID crisis, where we sailed through the crisis in a very good shape. We recovered very quickly. Part of the reason for that was that we were part of the Eurozone. Now, being in the Eurozone and also sometimes people think, you know, you can still run your own monetary policy and respond to the country-specific shocks in a better way if you're not part of the large currency area. I've been a governor or deputy governor now for 25 years, and I can assure you it's not the case. It just seems that you can, but actually you cannot. You always basically have to follow what the large central bank like the ECB is doing. I can give you one example only. When the ECB embarked on the quantitative easing, buying government bonds, we did not want to do the same thing. We did not want to go into the quantitative easing. In the end, we had to do it. Why? Because of the impossible trinity. You cannot have the stable exchange rate, open capital flows, and keep your interest rate in your own control. So what we did, basically, we did a quantitative easing by buying all the euros that the ECB was printing in order to prevent the appreciation of our currency. If we didn't do that, our currency would have appreciated so much that we would lose the competitiveness big time. So forget about the independent monetary policy being small open economy. In terms of the other goals, I mean, basically Croatia's goals are very similar than the Euro or EU goals at the moment, so we do not suffer any problems. If you look at the emphasis on the digitalization or the renewable energy in Europe, Croatia actually has missed the boat of bringing a lot of car industry in Croatia, because we joined the European Union a bit later. So most of the car industry went to Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia. At the moment, it seems to be an advantage, because the car industry is in trouble and is laying off people. Instead, the fastest growing industry now in Croatia is IT, which is pretty much in line with the EU goals. In terms of the value added, in terms of the employment, it's definitely IT industry. Renewables also, very important. We are lucky that most of our energy basically is clean. First is the hydropower, second is nuclear, and then we have a lot of solar and wind. So again, in line with the EU objectives, but also very good for Croatia. So I would say, and we have also built, interestingly, LNG terminal in 2021, just before 2022. So it became operational in autumn 2021, and then we have become now a large conduit for the import of the LNG into Europe after the Russian gas was stopped. So basically, Croatia is at the moment doing very well, and it has been actually the fastest growing economy in the European Union for the last 4 years. I would say so far, so good.
Well, thank you for sharing with us the balance, the art of balance, the domestic objectives and the Eurozone objectives. Thank you very much. Professor Roubini, let me ask you a very interesting question that you also want to answer. And this question is about the de-dollarization, okay? Now, do you actually think dollar is going to lose its dominant role in the global market? And, what kind of opportunities or risks and may this de-dollarization shift for the emerging markets? Go ahead. I'm going to tell you, given the time constraint, you have 3 minutes to answer my question.
3 minutes. I'll try my best. For the last couple of months, there have been a huge amount of headlines about the de-dollarization, the Economist as a cover story. And of course, what happened after the Liberation Day tariff has led to those kind of concerns. I think the talk about de-dollarization derives, one, by the fact that the US has been weaponizing the US dollar for national security and foreign policy goals, imposing sanctions against rivals and others. And secondly, there has been a recent damage to the US brand coming from the Trump tariff policies and the fact that the US still has very large twin fiscal and current account deficit. So you had a weakening of the dollar and increasing bond yields, leading to a panic that people are getting out of dollar assets. Now, people may not like the US dollar, but the question is, what's the alternative to the US dollar? Former US Secretary of Treasury Larry Summers said, you cannot replace something with nothing. And he said, Europe is a museum, China is an autocratic regime with limited rule of law, Japan is a nursing home, and Bitcoin is an experiment. So people might not like the dollar, but what's the alternative? The other point about global reserve currency is traditionally a global reserve currency is a country that has fully flexible exchange rates, no capital controls on inflows and outflows, has a rule of law, has deep capital markets that can issue in large amount a safe asset, and runs a large current account deficit to issue then a net amount of those safe assets. The dollar has those features. The RMB is in a country where there are capital controls, limited exchange rate flexibility, limited perception of rule of law, not deep capital market, and of course China is running a current account surplus, not a deficit. Now, what are the main benefits of having a global reserve currency? It's not international seigniorage. is not even the fact that you can finance yourself cheaply for your twin deficits. It's mostly your ability to impose financial sanction against your rivals and enemies and restrict access to your banking system and capital markets. So those are the main benefits. And I would argue that in spite of the concerns about the damage to the US brand, as I pointed out last night, American exceptionalism is going to remain because US is going to be number one, close to China. In the industry of the future, US growth might accelerate to 4%. If that happens, in spite of tariff, US is going to have a very large current account deficit, but not one driven by negative public savings, but rather by an investment boom in the private sector. And that implies that US exorbitant privilege is going to remain, because while some fixed income investors may get out of dollar assets, equity investor, FDI portfolio, are going to invest into the boom in capital spending in the industries of the future of the United States. So any weakness of the US dollar, in my view, is going to be somehow limited. Now, of course, China and other rivals of the US may want to depend less on the US dollar for cross-border payments because of the risk of the sanction. Today, the BRI 5G rails are used to carry data across the BRI countries. But in the future, of course, they can be used to carry cross-border transactions and avoid, to some extent, SWIFT. The BS had this M-Bridge project. It was shut down by the US, worried about China, Hong Kong, UAE, and others forming an alternative to the SWIFT system. But China can take that same technological model, doesn't need the BIS, and implement it. That's why China is building up a CBDC, a Euro RMB, not for domestic transaction, digital. After all, Alipay and WeChat Pay are better than any CBDC. But I think the CBDC is going to be used for cross-border payments. Now, the Europeans are worried about being left behind. That's why they're going to push for the euro. While the US, under Trump, is against the e-dollar, a CBDC, for ideological reasons, worries about government control of private transaction. So what will the US do? Tokenized deposit and stable coins. That's going to be the way in which the US is going to think about maintaining its primacy in international cross-border transaction. A couple of final observations. China has all these reserves and is worried about an escalation of the trade war leading, like it happened with Russia, to a seizure or freezing of those assets. What can China do? If they sell their treasury, they have a mark-to-market loss. That's a problem. And more importantly, if you sell treasury and sell the dollar and you buy back RMBs, you're going to lead to an appreciation of the RMB at a time where, given the trade and tariffs, you want a weaker RMB, not a stronger one. Now, you could sell treasuries in dollar and buy euro and yen, but then you're going to appreciate euro and yen. You're going to create trade frictions with Europe and Japan at a time where you want to be friendly with Europe and Japan. Third option, you can sell treasury in dollar and buy gold. Guess what? Gold has gone up 40% in the last year or so, exactly because PBOC and other central banks and rival of the US want to have an asset, and gold is the only liquid reserve asset. It's not a currency, cannot be seized. Gold as gold bullion, not gold financial GLD, cannot be seized if there is a trade or a financial war. The problem is that it's very hard, even if you do that, to decouple from access to the US banking system. Sovereign wealth funds of China, like CIC, and banks have large exposure to US assets, and therefore that's going to be a constraint. I'll make a final observation. People ask themselves, what are the views of the US about the strength of the dollar and de-dollarization? I would say that the American White House is very confused on that. There are those like Steve Miran, who wrote a paper that said that having a reserve currency role is a burden for the United States. It leads to a stronger dollar, it leads to deindustrialization, it leads to large trade deficits, and there are very small benefits coming from cheaper financing of your twin deficits. So he's in favor of what people talk about a Mar-a-Lago Accord, where people are going to agree on weakening the dollar, converting short-term treasury holdings into perpetuals to avoid a shock to the bond market and to pay for the security services provided by the US, and maybe impose capital controls on inflows, a tax on those foreign holdings of treasuries as a way of preventing excessive dollar appreciation. That's one view. If you look at what Secretary of Treasury Bessent says, it's just the opposite. He says if US fundamentals are going to be strong, the US dollar is going to remain strong. That is exactly the argument that the Biden and previous administration were making. Now, if you think about the position of the president himself, Trump is confused. On one side, he has been bashing the fact that the dollar has been too strong for too long, and that's led to deindustrialization, trade deficits, and, unquote, trade and allies and others have been ripping off the US. But he has threatened that if countries in the global south were to de-dollarize, he's going to impose a severe financial sanction against them. But, of course, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have a dollar as a global reserve currency and therefore a strong dollar and having a weak dollar at the same time to reduce the trade deficit. So Steve Miran speaks about capital controls on inflows, and instead Trump says just the opposite. That if you try to get out of dollar assets, they're going to impose sanctions against you if there are outflows out of US dollar. The point is that US doesn't have a coherent policy on trade, doesn't have even a coherent policy on the US dollar, its role as a global reserve currency. So there is utter confusion.
All right. Thank you, Professor Roubini. And okay. Okay, I'm going to switch back to Chinese now. 今天呢，我们有4位嘉宾，分别跟我们分享了很多的深刻的见解。他们有的言简意赅，有的特别善于雄辩。但是其实我们今天讨论的碎片化的问题呢，它没有。
Today, which is about fragmentation, wouldn't really warrant such a simple, uniform answer. We have guests from across the world. I hope that today's exchange will sparkle more research as well as cross-border cooperation. Now I would like to thank the sharing from all the previous speakers. Well, I would also like to invite Mr. Zhang Wei to chair the next session, which is about the building of the Great Bay Area. Thank you so much.